I was going to mention Wichita Lineman.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Listography. Got Kramzer and Joe with me today. We're back for another Album of the Year segment. Today we are talking about the year 1968. Like every year, a big year. So what do we got going on? January, the Tet Offensive happens in Vietnam. Sort of takes the hippie movement, the peace and love and free love and psychedelic drugs, and it gives it more of a social consciousness. It's now about protest, and there's an anti-war sentiment that is now intermingled with that sort of movement. It's also a big year in the civil rights movement. You've got songs like Everyday People by Sly and the Family Stone and Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud by James Brown becoming sort of anthems of that movement. Outside of that, you've also got all kinds of other things happening in music. The Beatles go to India, which sort of influences basically the rest of their output for the remainder of their career. They also launch Apple Corps later in '68. Johnny Cash kind of relaunches his career by recording a live album in a prison. David Gilmour joins Pink Floyd in '68. You've got the first performance of the New Yardbirds, which would eventually change their name to Led Zeppelin. They debut in September of '68. You also got a number of bands breaking up in '68. Cream play their farewell concert. Peter Tork leaves the Monkees. Steve Marriott storms off stage, effectively ending the Small Faces. The Zombies, Buffalo Springfield, and the Yardbirds all break up. So it's a kind of a changing of the guard in some senses in '68 as well. Joe, you want to get us into your picks?
Yeah, we can jump right in. '68 was a tough year for me, and I had about 5 albums that I wanted to include in my list, but I can't because there's got to be only 5. So for my number 5 slot, I have the Kinks by the Village Green Preservation Society. My favorite Kinks album. I think this is kind of just their creative peak. Very English. Super English, as English as you can get concept album, but I dig it. Number 4, I'm gonna go with Jimi Hendrix, Electric Ladyland, full of killer riffs, unbelievable guitar, just his kind of psychedelic peak. It wasn't quite as catchy maybe as Are You Experienced, but it was kind of just the continued progression and growth of him as the leading rock guitarist really at the time. Number 3, which will probably be your number 1s, I got the White Album by the Beatles, chock full of hits, great stuff from the Beatles as always. And number 2, a little number from the Byrds, I got Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which I just love. I think it's such a cool kind of not out of nowhere, but just the fact that it exists and it's so country rock because of Graham Parsons. I love it. It's kind of an oddity in musical history, but I wanted to put it at number 1, but I got to go with my boys and the Zombies for number 1, Odyssey and Oracle.
This is the first win and first nomination of the Zombies by Joe.
My favorite kind of Baroque pop. It's not quite as psychedelic as the front cover would have you believe. It's just filled with super catchy tunes. They broke up before it even came out. Wasn't even a hit, I think, until '69. Time of the Season kind of blew up, kind of part of the anti-war, peace movement. And they were already broken up, so kind of sucks because I think they could have done some cool stuff. I love Carousel 44, Love Song to a Person in Jail. I always thought that was really kind of funny. We got the kind of classic English literature callback on A Rose for Emily, and just everything on here is just really super catchy, just my kind of Baroque pop style, harpsichord, lots of organ keys. Just a super great record. I think it was ignored at its time, when it came out, but now I think it's kind of held in pretty high regard, and I'm one of those people who hold it in that high regard. So Odyssey and Oracle is my number 1 for 1968, but it was a tough choice. There's so many good albums in this year.
I agree. There are a lot of really good albums this year, but I think my index is a little different. I think there's a clear-cut winner, and I think there's a lot of heavy hitters here putting out albums, but I don't think I think for a lot of the artists releasing albums, it's not quite their best work. For like the fourth year in a row, Kink's album On the Outside, I feel bad, sorry guys, but not in my top 5. So I've got as my finalists Bookends by Simon and Garfunkel, Music from Big Pink by the band, Song to a Seagull by Joni Mitchell, and I also have Electric Ladyland by Jimi Hendrix Experience. But the standout and the winner for me is the White Album by the Beatles.
This is the first win and 5th nomination of the Beatles by Kramzer.
You can't have too much of a good thing, and that's the White Album to me. You get every little piece of the Beatles, every style, every piece of wit, everything melodramatic, everything romantic is on this album. I don't think it's too long. I think there's just a lot of creativity and a lot of flavor. It's like a big all-star cast of their styles. So many great songs. I mean, Happiness is a Warm Gun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Revolution Number 9, Back to the USSR, Julia, go on and on and on. This is, a fantastic album. It was a landmark album for music. The Beatles were already hot up to the point. I think this album kind of reached even more people than Sgt. Pepper was and Revolver. So, I think I don't really think it's close. I think it's the White Album by a mile. Jason mentioned that they went to India and that changed everything. And apparently they pretty much only used 1 or 2 instruments in India to write this entire album, which is absolutely fascinating from a songwriting standpoint, and then the transition into the studio output, just amazing. This is the peak Beatles right here, and probably the year after. The White Album, my favorite album of 1968.
All right, so as I've kind of alluded to in the previous videos, doesn't really get super difficult for me until the 70s. Pretty much every year in the 60s, there's like 3 or 4 standouts, and then I've got to kind of search around to find what to fill the other spots with, except for 68. 68 is the one year in the 60s where I have 6 standouts that I really want to get on this list, and I got to make a painful cut. So, Joe, I'm glad you got to speak about it for a little bit, because just missing my list is Sweetheart of the Rodeo. So my top 5 going to be Aerial Ballet by Harry Nilsson, Music from Big Pink by the band, Astral Weeks by Van Morrison, Odyssey and Oracle by the Zombies, and my number 1, I'm with Cram on this, got to be the White Album.
This is the 3rd win and 6th nomination of the Beatles by Jason.
Like he said, just a little bit of everything that the Beatles ever did can be found on this record. I think they're all at the top of their game. They're kind of like going off and writing on their own, but there's also tracks like Your Blues where they're playing together as a band, again, which you haven't really heard in a while. And I think it's great. I wouldn't want any songs cut. I don't think there's any filler. I love all of it. And the way it just sort of all comes together, I wouldn't say it's seamless. It's kind of all over the place, but it's great. I love it. Any other thoughts on 68 before we close it out?
I'm surprised no Rolling Stones made the list. Beggar's Banquet, kind of a return to their bluesy, rootsy sound after their kind of detour into psychedelia. I thought that would be on Kramzer's list. I think that's the only album that none of us mentioned that might kind of, really make a lot of the critics' top 5s. I think that album's pretty well considered, but I think we pretty much covered everything else that came out. Maybe no love for Velvet Underground either, which is fine with me.
Yeah, we got no White Light, White Heat. You got Randy Newman's debut, which is awesome.
Traffic starts up. I believe this is their debut year. But for me, Beggar's Banquet, I have an interesting relationship with the Rolling Stones because I think they've got a lot of really good albums and maybe only a few great albums. I think their catalog works better as a whole rather than going through their albums individually. And everything that they do on Beggar's Banquet, I think they're going to do better next year with Let It Bleed. So I knew of it for 68, but it wasn't really on my radar. I don't think it's some of their best stuff.
Interesting. All right. Well, we will see how that plays out in 69 with Let It Bleed. And we'll see you next week. And until then, take care, everybody. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell so you get notifications, and we'll see you then.